asked for 4 slots. I think I should have asked for 5. So today I'm going to talk about education. And then if we have time, I'm going to move on to various social aspects of the black middle class. And then in the last lecture, I want to deal with politics. So I might have to split one lecture up, which isn't very good technique. I apologize for that. But let's just see how we go and see how the conversation goes. I'm going to start off with looking at education and what has happened, because I think education is extremely important. I think most of us are pretty aware about the importance of education and what it does in terms of the individual's prospects in life. And I think what cuts across South African society is the intense interest which parents take in getting their kids the best possible education they can get in their particular circumstances. And on the whole, you'll find that, I suppose, broadly speaking, established middle-class people look at getting their kids a good education to consolidate, basically, their kids' prospects in life, to presume that they will continue being middle-class. Or I think in the black community particularly, education has always historically been seen as an important step on the ladder to move upwards in society. And that's understandable, given what we were talking about in the history of the black middle class and the way in which the mission education and acquisition of literacy played a very important role in the foundation and development of that early black middle class. Now, what happened after 1994? Because we all know about the sad history of education in this country, Bantu education and so on, and the way in which education was racially segregated and was not just inferior, just terribly inferior for blacks, of course. Now, when the ANC came into power, it was basically faced with the prospect of integrating something like 15 educational systems. By the time you've added up the educational systems for whites, coloureds, Indians, etc., and then you've got the various homeland educational systems, you ended up with 15 different educational systems, and the daunting prospect was uniting them into one system. And obviously the great aim of the ANC was to improve access and the quality of education for everybody across the board. Now, there was going to be, as we shall see, something of a what Crane Sudian, who used to be DVC here, and a very prominent educationist, has called a class settlement around what happened in the educational system after 1994. In the very last few days, in the 1990s basically, as the prospect of democratization loomed, the National Party government had granted ownership, essentially, of schools to school governing bodies of parents and teachers, sometimes with pupil representation thrown in. And basically the school governing bodies were given powers of hiring and admitting particular students. Crucially, they were now allowed to impose fees. So this was a significant devolution of power, which had previously been with government bodies, to school governing boards. And this was basically referred to the old white high schools. And the ANC was faced with an immediate dilemma. To retain what became known as the Model C schools, originally the term Model C came from a grading A, B, and C, but basically it had ended up with the most important facet of these was the Model C schools, which were basically the old white high schools. And the ANC was faced with a dilemma, and it had a whole clutch of educationists behind it. What to do with the white high schools? Was it simply to increase black access and keep their relatively good quality high? in which case there was a feeling that you keep the white middle class in the system, and there was a feeling that if you can keep the white middle class in the system, then this is a way of getting middle class angst to make sure that those schools keep their quality. On the other hand, the problem with doing this was that if you simply just allowed the existing white high schools to continue with school governing boards with considerable autonomy, then, and just allowing increased access, then you're going to, in many ways, just simply retain middle class privilege unless you do something very radical with what went below. Now, the South African Schools Act of 1996 divided the educational system into 5 quintiles, and basically these ranged from 1 to 5, not surprisingly. The key facet of this was that they all had different levels of state funding. And effectively, the high levels, quintiles 4 and 5, were to be fee-paying. These were effectively the old Model C schools. They lost that terminology then, but it's often used because it's a familiar way. Quintiles 4 and 5 is rather clumsy. And the school governing boards were confirmed, if not given, considerable powers over their admissions, language policy, hiring of teachers, and so on, although no explicit racial discrimination henceforth was to be allowed. Lower quintile schools were also enabled and expected to charge fees because the educational expenditure in the budget was already high. But as we know, many black parents have been unable to afford even the very modest fees that the schools at the bottom of the ladder tend to charge. And the figure I have, well, 2011, I don't know what the present figure is, 2011, 55% of learners are still paying no fees at all. But let's just look at these important powers which school governing boards had. Admissions, well, I think admissions policy really is, you can say this is where, if you use these terminology, class struggle may come in. Because what admissions policy gives you is the right not only to admit, but to exclude. So school governing boards were giving considerable capacity to keep out those they did not want. Now, it may not be that they could explicitly use racial terminology, but there are all sorts of other facets, other social indicators which you may be able to use to keep those people you don't want in the system out. Language, of course, is another issue, but we may want to go into that in question time. Hiring was extremely important because, of course, what happens in the former Model Cs is that the state pays for a certain number of school teachers, and the school governing boards have capacity to hire others. And the fees which have been imposed by school governing boards are very, very considerable now, so that if you're going to a good quality Model C school, you may be paying up to something like 30,000 rands per year these days for one child. So that's pretty considerable and pretty much on par with what you're paying at university as well. Now, the outcome has been a two-tier educational sector, and if I can quote two of our leading educationists, we have a poorly reserved educational sector serving the poor and mainly black population, while the wealthy have access to private and semi-private schools. Government policy has allowed the middle class to secure control of the historical ex-white school sector, empowering a new deracialized middle class to obtain semi-private education. So in other words, what we have had is the fact that the school governing boards are able to pay fees. They get rather little subsidy these days. I think for when I was doing interviewing of heads, I think the sort of subsidy in a school like Rondebosch High School, they're only getting about something remarkably small per year, something like 200 rands subsidy per pupil for a year from the state. So really, many of these former high schools have become very, very heavily dependent on the need to impose fees. Crane-Soudian, I mentioned this term, he described what happened as a class settlement, whereby the old middle class has secured buy-in from the new middle class around the notion of good schooling, and black parents see themselves as buying education as a commodity, enabling children to gain access to the world of work. Now, of course, most of these schools will pay at least strong lip service to the notion of a liberal education, the role of the humanities, and how wonderful it is to have a broad education spread across the range of disciplines and so forth. But I think what we find is that most parents, not just black parents, have a quite instrumental view to education, which will extend to their really just thinking of how their kids are going to get on, are they going to get access to university, what sort of job they're going to get, and so forth. And of course, what you also have set up in this is an enormous, basically, market of education, of the setting up enormous competition between different schools, even within the semi-state sector, so that Model Cs will compete with each other, and they will compete to get parents in. So they're basically competing to get bums on seats, and they'll be placing much emphasis upon their classroom sizes, what they offer, the facilities they offer, the sports opportunities, and so on and so forth. And this increasing market in education has encouraged a flight from township schools and hopping up public schooling hierarchy by busing or moving for better suburbs. Some very interesting work done by a Canadian sociologist in Durban. He spent 2 or 3 years there looking at the school system and what was going on. And basically what he found was that there was an enormous amount of actual physical movement of people to get into the best schools. Of course, there is some sort of connection between area where you live and your right to access that education. So what you get is quite literally quite a number of people moving house so that they can gain access to better schooling for their kids. And this goes across the racial spectrum. So for instance, at the bottom of the system, you will get those black parents who can afford it moving out of the township into, they're buying a house in an area they can afford. And of course this may mean not just former white housing, but former Indian housing or whatever. So they will actually move area to get better access for their kids. Alternatively, there is massive busing, or taxiing basically, for much of the black population, to get kids into better schools. So you have got this hopping going on, and it's been accompanied by a very significant expansion in private schooling. Now, of course, this country has an old established network of private schools, the bishops and the St. Andrews and the Michael houses of this world. Basically, in former times, they catered for largely the Anglo elite, whereas the Afrikaans elite tended to stay in the state system. They have continued into the present system, and they, of course, they began to open admission bit by bit from the late 1980s, but little bit increased pace in the 1990s. Today, they have remained substantially white, but have increasingly granted access to black pupils through, of course, if black parents can pay fees, well enough, but also through scholarships and endowments and so forth, and incidentally quite a lot of granting access to kids from the region, from the Botswanas and the Zambias and so on and so forth. And their attraction is, of course, again, very, very high standards of teaching, very high standards of wonderful facilities and so on, and that they tend to pursue Cambridge A-levels, which are deemed by many parents, many well-off parents, to be much more internationally acceptable and granting access not only to South African universities, but to universities overseas. And I think that what you also identify in these schools is an education which is explicitly geared to the global market so that these kids can actually move out of the country. And perhaps one of the distressing things we see in this country, I'm a victim of it too, is that white kids tend to move quite very often, will go overseas once they finish their education here, either go to university overseas, either at even bachelor's level, master's level or whatever, and they tend to stay where they go for one reason or another. So we're losing a significant amount of highly educated person power. But what is interesting is that not the way in which the very high-level schools have begun to change, but the increased competition that they are facing from the very significant opening up of private schools around the country, from basically sponsored or established by global education companies, the two major of which in this country are Curro and Advtech, which runs Crawford Schools. But the growth of private schools is quite enormous. And what is happening, I mean, just if you drive around suburbs, certainly in Johannesburg, where I lived until very recently, you're going to find Curro schools springing up all over the place. And they are at the junior levels and they go into the high school levels as well. And a lot of parents are moving their kids out of the Model C, the former Model C schools, now into the private sector. And there is tensions around, of course, the racial complexion of the school, of the pupil bodies, the learner bodies that such schools have. But of course, also that we do find black admission into these schools as well. But partly why this is happening is, of course, that pressures upon the former white schools, by the government in particular, to start increasing admissions, various pressures they have retained to start increasing access. And of course that leads to bigger classroom, bigger class sizes and so forth. And there is, I think, in the educationists, or some educationists begin to think that the standard in the former white high schools, not across the board, but certainly in some cases, is beginning to slip. And in fact, one prominent educationist said to me when she was talking about the opening up of private schools, is the way that Curro in particular has aimed its strategy at trying to identify those former Model C schools which are beginning to slip off the edge and become, she said, totally blackened. And a Curro school will then open in that suburb. These Curro and Advtech schools tend to are aimed, I think, very much at a middle-class market, but we have also got the growth of a lot of entrepreneurial ventures at the bottom of the system as well, with the growth of low-fee private schools, very often in CBDs. They will occupy all sorts of strange buildings, from floors on high-rise, which used to be offices, through to warehouses and so on and so forth. But certainly this is something which is, we don't know, I think, exactly how large this sector is, but it certainly is growing in significance. It's difficult to estimate the precise size of private schooling. It is very diverse. I think 5% is probably a significant underestimate, so I can't give you the exact figure, indeed an educationist. But what is happening is that private schools are seen as providing a better quality education. But what is happening here, broadly speaking, is that the educational system shows a very significant continuing imprint of racial segmentation. But broadly speaking, I think we will find races being replaced by class as a determinant of class. Races being replaced by class as a determinant of who goes where. Clearly, at the bottom of the system, where the system is so manifestly failing, in the townships in particular, those you're not going to see a white face in those classes. But if you go to the Model Cs, you're going to see, as there should be, a lot of black faces these days. If we, broadly speaking, and I'm going to rather skip through what's happening in higher education, because that's a whole new ballgame really, but I think broadly speaking, in many ways what has happened in the higher educational sector has been, in the schooling sector, much of that has happened in the higher educational sector too. And I've just got some figures here. If we look at what is the most significant aspect, of course, is the widening of admission, the significantly fast widening of admission to black students since basically democratization. So the figure here is 286,000 in 1995 to the 2012 figure of 660,000. And of course you've got increased admission for coloureds and Indians as well. Meanwhile, the admission of whites to the universities and the universities of technology has actually slipped from 2014 to 172,000. So, there has been a significant expansion of access to the universities. And of course, as we all know from ongoing controversies, funding has not kept up, because what has happened also during this period is, of course, that the government funding for the universities has slipped, so that the universities now, which used to be about 50 or 60% funded by government, are now only directly funded by about 30 to 35%. So they, in turn, have had to increase their fees and go for so-called third stream funding. A restructuring of the university system was conducted under Kadar Azmal, late Kadar Azmal, when he was Minister of Education. Basically, this is crudely put, but broadly speaking, it largely left the highest ranking white universities untouched, with the exception of what is now UKZN, which was integrated with Durban West, the University of Durban Westville at the time, whilst allowing for the upward mobility of the best of the rest. What we find in the university ranking sector is that some former historically black universities and some of the less good historically white universities have either maintained their place in the pecking order or managed to move up the university pecking order significantly. The two which have done that most significantly have been the University of Johannesburg, which used to be RAU, whose standards were, let us say, a little bit dicky previously, but the University of Johannesburg now has definitely moved up the pole, as has UWC and Nelson Mandela, former University of Port Elizabeth. There has been, in all the historically white universities, of course, a very, very significant increase in black enrollment, although, of course, it's uneven across those universities and across the different faculties. But of course, when we go to the former historically black universities, they continue to cater to poor and black constituents. Now, just to a last few lines on this is that, so what we have is still, against this background, a very heavily skewed output of graduates along racial lines. We know that if you look at the graduation rates for students along racial lines, you will find the effects of poor schooling, because we know that many black kids get into university with a very poor educational background, basically. They may have their matric, but they haven't been equipped to deal with some of the aspects that that university education requires. The limitations of university funding means that many of the bridging courses, which were initially established in the early 1990s to cater to this, were slashed in budget costs, in budget cuts and so forth. There is an inability to pay fees, of course, amongst many black parents, maybe mixed with a bit of an unwillingness as well. And so we have the shocking figures of the way of black graduation. So just 20% of black students graduated at the end of their 3-year degree in 2009. So we know that for the overwhelming number of black students, it takes more than the minimum time to get their degree. And many, of course, fall out along the way. Unsurprisingly, we get to the present moment of fees must fall, and I just put it to you that perhaps the momentum behind fees must fall, going beyond the rhetoric, is in fact, in some ways, it is a protest of the aspirant black middle class. I'm not suggesting that's all it is, but I think that's a very significant part of the dynamism behind the remarkable things we have seen in the last 2 or 3 years. So that's a very hasty overview of where I see what's happened in the educational system and the great importance it has played in the upward momentum of the black middle class. Now, I'm going to break off now just for, see if we've got some questions and discussion about this. And I don't need, that's what I need. And then if we've got some time, I'm going to move on to the next split lecture, so I apologise for that again. But let me just go to a couple of questions there.
Yes, well, relating to what I said asked yesterday, which is about the politics of this, the quality of black schools doesn't have to be as bad, the poor black schools doesn't have to be as bad as it is, and it's partly because the teachers have not been held to a higher standard, and I put it to you that that's because sad to teachers in Bantustans who may have been thought of as collaborators before became voters, became a constituency. And so by succumbing to what is a black middle class group of teachers, it was done at the expense of the pupils.
I would tend to agree with you. And I think actually in my book I cover SADTU quite in some detail. And I think basically what you do have there, as you say, is a semi-professional grouping which has got considerable political and power and quite a lot of strategic power where it is located. And of course a lot of the angst coming with government has come over the capacity of the government to control teachers. Are they in the classroom and so on and so forth. And the whole issue around school inspectors and so forth. And that goes back partly, so the SADTU says it goes back to the apartheid times and the way in which black inspectors were used to enforce language education and so on. But clearly that's not just the answer. So there is a real issue, and I know that it is recognised, I think, by the Ministry of Education, right up to the top. One educationist who was an advisor to Angie Motshekga said to me, she's a very, very progressive educationist. She said, oh gosh, I wouldn't have thought I'd have heard it from her from 1994. She said, God, if there was one trade union I'd like to ban, it's SADTU. And she's very close to Angie Motshekga. And so I can't believe, but Angie Motshekga has sort of had some rather feeble tries, but they've not come to anywhere. Partly because, of course, of SADTU's position within COSATU, and the COSATU itself is pretty fraught these days, and SADTU has some quite highly placed people in COSATU.
Stick of 19% of the black graduates in 2009. Is there any change on that coming up to date, or is that pretty much a stationary figure?
I can't actually give you those. Sorry? Oh, sorry. The question was asked whether this is a stagnant figure or whether it's getting worse or increasing. I'm going to have to say to you, since I wrote the book, I haven't kept up with the figures, so I don't actually know. But I think the key aspect of this is that it's very deeply embedded. The fact that, the more, and I can only think that the more the government feels it's got to increase access to universities. On the other hand, the universities are saying the more underprepared students we're taking, the less capacity we have to actually give them a decent education. So the whole system is actually creaking. So it seems to be, I think the government, it's now got fees must fall, it's under enormous political pressure, and the easiest way is to actually increase access. Now, I know academics are struggling. How on earth are we going to deal with this? Especially when we haven't got the funding to do the academic development programs which we need to implement. So, yeah.
While you're talking about this, the majority of these students obviously still came out of the old system or the township school system, and not out of the model C schools or private schools. And this figure here, 2009.
One of the interesting things is that what we find with the black students, certainly at some of the higher-ranking historically white universities, we find that a considerable number of their parents have had some form of tertiary level education. Whether that's not necessarily degree level education, it may be diploma, it may be that they've had some sort of training as nurses or whatever, but it's very common to find that at least one parent has had some background in higher education, whether that's in a Bantustan university or whatever. So again, I think it's not just the fact that they might have come from township schools, or they might have but I imagine that you've got most of these kids getting into university. I think most of them are actually coming from the former Model Cs. There are, of course, some coming from the township education, but it's a pretty hard road to tread. So this gentleman up here.
Two questions. Firstly, to look at that 19% from the other point of view, how many eventually graduate at all who register? Secondly, nursing and teaching used to be career paths for many, many people. Colleges were closed. What's happened to those who previously had gone to teachers training or nursing college?
There may be some people in this room who actually have better figures, but I rather think I have seen fairly recent figures. You've only got about 50% of black students who enter university actually finishing the course, because you've got failures, you have got discontinuances, you've just got people who cannot pay the fees. So, and I imagine that if you increase access, as seem to be that the government is doing, and if you can't provide these kids with a decent university education because of stresses in teaching, then I can only imagine that the failure rate is going to increase unless you lower the standard. So that's always the cry in these debates about standards, access, resources, and so on. But I don't think it's a very pretty picture at the moment.
And our university.
Sorry.
Second question.
Was the
What's happened
to the nursing?
to go to training?
Well, of course, many people would say that closing the teaching colleges is a huge mistake, etc. But the same happened with nursing. Basically, nursing and teaching have been incorporated into university degree programs, partly by certainly with nursing, by the lobbying of the nursing bodies themselves, which saw, in fact, if nursing becomes a degree, it gets higher status and so forth. But they've been absorbed into universities. Yeah, so this lady here.
Thinking about technical education, I know universities are looked upon as opportunities for upward mobility, but what about skills learning, technical education? Not everybody can go to university. As you can see, the throughput is very low. But
Yes,
I
okay.
have the impression there's resistance to technical education.
Again, what you find is, I'm not an educational expert, so I'm probably not the best person to be answering this question, but what you also find is clearly the technical colleges have been devalued by government policy. They have also been suffering from poorer funding and so forth. What you have got is quite an uptake of that sort of education, again by the private sector, notably in terms of the sort of subjects like commercial subjects and so on. So you have got the Damelins of this world multiplying around the country.
Ask about the role of UNISA as a sort of open university for everyone in South Africa. I was in Polokwane. I visited their local, if you like, offices, crowded with very young, very well educated black people who saw that as a way forward. They didn't have to leave their home areas, and it was giving them a good quality degree. To what extent is that true, do you think, and to what extent has the black middle class in the rural areas gone into UNISA? What are the figures around that?
It's an excellent question, and I'm going to have to say again, I cannot give you an answer about figures. I don't have any particular knowledge of what's happened in UNISA, but I can only imagine, as you suggest, that UNISA students are overwhelmingly black students. And I come across a lot of individual students who have done a degree through UNISA, and gosh, I think if you've got a UNISA degree, you really have worked hard because you do it on your own. Yeah. Gentleman here.
Just to back up to something you were saying before and support it, that 19% which had some interest, you were wondering about how many actually do. It's about 46%, so you were right. 46% was the last number I saw. Now, what I found interesting in all this journey is that you can make a dramatic difference to the 19% and the 46% with mentoring from people from surrounding white communities typically. The reasons why they drop out aren't that they're idle and stupid. It's because they can't afford the taxi there, because it's a long way from the township to CPUT or UWC or whatever it may be. And because the shock of going from a shack to a college is huge. It's very hard for many of us to understand. And so a mentoring program, which is really easy to implement with white volunteers, I mean, they don't have to be white, but I mean people who have been through this journey and understand it. Even if, the program we have, they just call them once a week, just so they know they've got somebody and they can get advice, particularly the chaos of last autumn with Fees Must Fall, where students had other people coming in with fire extinguishers.
Yeah.
Out there, and it was a frightening time, and many of the students who are going to be able to talk about a number now just vanish. They go to the Eastern Cape, say, I'm going to find them again. Heard them back in and say, come on, you can do this. We're up to 94%. 94% of graduates.
Okay, yeah. I think it's a...
The important number is how many in total are graduating.
Oh, yes.
Not how many are falling down. Is that number progressively increasing at a reasonable rate to supply efficiencies?
So I think, if I can just add to that, I think one of the things is, of course, it's quite important in what disciplines black students are graduating. And the numbers, a lot of black students will go, obviously some will go into the sciences. I was quite, actually, sorry, this is an aside, when I was in sociology at Wits, we did a course for engineers, and I had to go along to the engineering faculty one day to talk about a particular course we ran for the engineers, are fairly reluctant sociologists. So, and I was talking to them, and I said, what percentage of your first year students are black? And he said about 90%. I was just amazed, absolutely amazed, but that's good. But what we do find is that the professional associations like accounting are also instituting a lot of post-university programs to fund black students through their articles and so on and so forth. So there's a question here from the lady.
It's crucial that a good education starts at the primary school level. Now, if a teacher at a primary school can't go to university, where are they trained? Because it's pathetic what's going on.
Well, yes, I mean, I'm not an expert in education, so I'm not going to get involved in all the details of educational policy, but I agree that everybody is now saying that what's happening in the schools is the problem, not actually what's happening at the university.
Just quickly to go back to numbers. Over 1 million kids started 12 years ago. 27,000 wrote mathematics and passed. Now, out of over 1 million. Those 27,000 are the ones that are eligible for medicine, actuarial science, business science, engineering, science. That's the base that South Africa has to work with. And those 27,000 kids are not all black. They're not all going to graduate. They're not all going to go into professions, and they're not all going to stay in South Africa. So I think back to what the lady said, we've got to start at grade R, and we've got to sort out the language policy, because once they get through into grade 12 and are accepted, even if they're accepted at UCT, so many simply can't make it because their quality of the English language isn't good enough, the quality of their mathematics isn't good enough, and they just die. And mentoring would help, but only to a limited extent. If you don't have that foundation, you can't catch up. It just doesn't work.
Right. Okay. Well, I think we all have our strong opinions about what's happening in the educational system. So, and we all know a little bit about it, but not all of us know too much about it. But I certainly found that, I'd never written on education before, and I must admit, when I started looking at it, I was woefully ignorant, and I found it an absolutely fascinating subject to be looking at. Now, as I say, I should have had these, I should have asked Fezia for 5 sessions. So what I'm going to do, because I'm going to just now move on to some various, yes, I'm going to have to do the rather uncomfortable thing of, now what's this going on here? There we are. Just switching gear halfway through. So, and let's see where we get to today. Changing lifestyles. Right. Just very simply, where does the black middle class live? Of course, the black middle class has moved from, historically, black middle class has moved from rural areas to towns. Even in rural areas, the black middle class has moved to towns, or small rural towns. And in those early days, even small towns had their social structures in which there was a small black middle class living within their own community. And of course, I've mentioned in previous lectures that the black middle class grew substantially in the homelands under the Bantustan policy. Now, today the black middle class is overwhelmingly concentrated in the cities, notably in Gauteng, but is largely absent from Cape Town, as we were talking some time ago. Now, John Simpson of the Unilever project here kindly sent me some of the stuff on the latest Black Diamond surveys, and he sent me, and this was included in what he sent me. And okay, we talked about methodology in the first lecture and how we count black middle class and so forth. So we have to suspend those judgments, but this is clearly indicative. So this will be based on the living standards measures. But if you look at the concentration of the black middle class in Gauteng compared with the rest of the country, then it is very, very remarkable. And so this, people are straining, we've got 46% in Gauteng, we've got 18% in KwaZulu-Natal, 8% in the Eastern Cape, and we're just down to 3% in the Western Cape here. Now, obviously, that reflects the particular racial demographics in this part of the world, but obviously it says something else as well, and you might have your own views on what that is. Somebody was asking me the other day, where does the black middle class in Cape Town live in Cape Town? And partly being new to Cape Town, but partly perhaps there isn't a particular area where the black middle class live. But perhaps somebody could inform me after the lecture. But there we are. It's not very, in terms of what's going on in the Western Cape, it's not a very pretty picture concerned in terms of the black middle class presence. Now, what's been happening? I think the expansion of the black middle class has been a very important factor in what's going on spatially in this country, which is quite a complex issue, because you have got it's not just a matter of people moving from one area to another, just moving up a hierarchy, because all sorts of things are changing as well. You have got changes in transport systems, you've got the growth of new suburbs and so on. And in the later apartheid period, we had blacks moving into the CBDs of the larger cities as whites moved out to the suburbs. For instance, what happened in Joburg in the 1960s was the very significant road building program. You have got the increasing purchase of cars by white middle class, and so increased transport accessibility to suburbs meant that people started moving further and further out of the centre of town. And in Joburg, of course, you had the added factor that, of course, you had the building of Sandton as a counter-attraction to the CBD, and basically the movement of large amounts of white business to Sandton, and that moved a lot of, so you get the very significant expansion of the northern suburbs, which were some of the more snooty white areas were. But what you've got now, of course, and of course, as whites moved out, blacks moved into the flats and houses which they were vacating. But what we have got now is the post-1994 black middle-class movement into white suburbs. Well, that's of course a précis, because what is also happening is if you remember when I was talking about what's happening in the educational system, it's not just the white suburbs which are supposedly being deracialized, it's the Indian suburbs, the former Indian suburbs and coloured suburbs as well, which tended to have somewhat better standards of housing and so forth than than township areas. So you've got blacks moving hopping from one area to the other. They may move from a township into a former Indian area, then move into a lower white middle class area, and so forth. You've also, so you have got that movement. You've got black movement into the white suburbs, and you have got transformation of the townships as well. Soweto is a significantly different place today than it was in the mid-1970s. You've got the development of restaurants. You've got the Maponya shopping mall, which is a very large mall. And you have got the expansion of middle-class housing. So you have got quite a lot of fancy housing now being built inside the townships themselves. And of course, spatial mobility is strongly associated with the expansion of home ownership, which was previously disallowed to blacks. I've got some figures here taken from some sort of a state agency, so take it with a little bit of salt. But the proportion of black owners who owned mid-value and higher-value homes outside the townships grew from 13% in 2003 to 19% in 2013. Now that's not a huge figure, but nonetheless it does indicate quite a significant movement of blacks into white areas. When you do get black middle class movement into historically white areas, blacks always are in the very significant minority, but nonetheless it is beginning to happen. And I've got a figure here that overall black ownership of all residential property grew from 37% to 42%, aided doubtless by the whole process of granting ownership to people of RDP houses. What's also was happening was the black middle class are part of the growth of what geographers called edge cities. And these are described as totalized suburbs. So when you grow, Santon, I suppose, is the original edge city, is that basically you build a new city. You're not only building high rises for offices, you're building shopping malls, you're building housing to go with it, you end up with sports clubs being built and so on. You end up building basically a new city outside the bounds of the old city. And of course these are very attractive areas for many people to live in, and they are particularly attractive to the better off parts of the black middle class. You also have the growth of gated communities of differential densities. Again, I'm speaking very much from Joburg, where I'm much more familiar. You have got massive growth of gated communities of different standards, but you have huge blocks of flats going up, basically, which are gated, and they seem to be very significantly peopled by blacks of different, I think, socio-income groups. But I think most of those people will be in at least white-collar employment. And so when we're talking about the desegregation of suburbs, I would say yes and no. It is taking place, I think, across class lines. Certainly, if we look at what's going on in Joburg, there's significant suggestion that the black elite, the better off portion of what you might call the black middle class, but many of the politicians and so forth, have tended to buy houses in the northern suburbs. These are the better off parts of Johannesburg. And the less well-off are moving into the southern suburbs, which were more historically open to the white middle class. And of course, the townships remain exclusively black. So I think the movement the black movement in suburbia is, I think, a very significant part of what has taken place and what is taking place, I think, with increasing pace as we go along. Now, because I'm sort of in between, I'm going to probably leave that just there for the moment, because if I get onto a new topic. So are there any questions, comments about this whole issue of movement into the movement of blacks into suburbs? Any questions here? Gentlemen at the back.
The one problem that I have is when you quote two percentages from 2003 to 2013, it's a straight line movement. One should have a graph where you see the in-between to see if it's an increasing movement or decreasing. It's quite misleading just to have two figures.
No, that's that's fine. Yep, I hadn't always got. But I mean, the problem with this is that it's not always that easy to get the figures, and these aren't always the figures which are available in the standard sources like Stat South Africa and so on. And when you're dealing with resident movement into suburbs, you're dealing with estate agents, and the stuff that they give you have to really look at quite carefully. But I think that what is happening is, nonetheless, we do know, and you can see it visibly, you can see it, that there is significant movement. Again, it's still very much the minority, but it depends across what towns you're looking at and where you're looking and so forth. It may be suburb specific.
Do you feel it is accelerating, in fact?
It's certainly a constant, well, no, I wouldn't say constant movement, it's significantly happening. And what is also happening is the building of new suburbs, essentially to cater for new middle classes of whatever background. Some interesting work going on at WITS about what's happening in gated communities, and you do find that you have got a very significant racial mixes in some of the new sort of fairly modest housing gated communities which is happening. What is happening is that you get people living cheek by jowl quite happily. They're middle class people of different racial backgrounds living next door to each other. What you do find, though, is that they're not mixing socially, but they're living in the same gated community. So that is one of the characteristics. What does happen is that in the white suburbia, the black middle class as a minority often feel very isolated. And of course in Joburg it's not that, there's not much. You've got the high walls, it's not just gated communities, you've got high walls, you've got the added thing that half the time you don't know who your neighbour is in the first place. So if you're coming from a township where literally everybody's packed in, that's probably your feeling of isolation is more intense than for the average white middle class person anyway.
In Botswana, the middle class have houses in the urban areas, but also very much retain a house in their village. The extended family live around the house in the village, the nuclear family in the urban areas. Is that a pattern which is discerned here?
Well, I think generally this is a refrain. If you, in sort of focus groups which I engaged in, this is actually quite a familiar frame. That a lot of people, yes, they move into a house in the suburbs, but then they often will, especially I think younger men, they will go back to the townships at the weekend to joll and to have drinks and everything, and then they live in the suburbs during the week. But I think at the same time there is a lot of tension around this, because it's around, and we'll be talking about this tomorrow, is that this tension between the nuclear family and the extended family, and the way in which people are financially torn this way and that, because they've got to cater for brothers and sisters and nephews and God knows what. At the same time, they've got to pay off the bond, they've got to pay for their own skids school education and so on and so on. And there's a limited amount of money to go round. And what seems to be, and certainly one of my colleagues at WITS found in terms of spending patterns amongst township Africans, which may well be happening elsewhere as well, amongst township Africans was that very often if they want to buy something, they will buy